My name is Kellie Tranter. It's lovely to be with you this evening, and welcome to the second in a series of webinars on the US-Australian Alliance. I thank IPAN and specifically Annette Brownlee and Sam Brennan for the invitation to facilitate this event and to chair this important inquiry. For too long, the Australian public has been sidelined from the debate about Australia's foreign policy, particularly in relation to the alliance with the United States. Consequently, many people have worked hard to pull this inquiry together, the first of its kind, to give you a chance to have your say on the matter. It gives people a chance to elevate their voices and the discussion above the current toxic political discourse to help our country reinvent itself independently of the United States and to take responsibility for and determine our foreign and defence policies. We must decide, in short, what's in Australia's national interests. So far, we've received 36 written submissions and 1 audio submission. For information, you can head to the People's Inquiry website, and that's independentaustralia.com.au, or submit any questions you have to the IPAN inquiry email, which is ipan.inquiry@gmail.com. The website also provides links to Facebook and Twitter in the top right-hand corner, and I'd like to acknowledge and thank each of the supporting organisations listed on the website. One further important announcement is that IPAN is launching a national questionnaire titled IPAN People's Inquiry, Exploring the Case for an Independent and Peaceful Australia. Have your say. IPAN developed the questionnaire using SurveyMonkey as a result of a suggestion made by a person who actually provided the inquiry with a submission and is now working with IPAN to promote the inquiry. So thank you to that person. We hope the questionnaire about the alliance with the US will reach a greater number and diversity of people and encourage them to also put in a submission, and we encourage you to do so. That is https:// www.surveymonkey.com/r/C M, so that's triple M, KTS, all in uppercase. The theme of tonight's webinar is Defence and Foreign Policy. Dr Vince Scappatura is the leader of the inquiry's Military and Defence panel. He teaches politics and international relations at Macquarie University and is the author of the US Lobby and Australian Defence Policy, published by Monash University. I have a copy of that here. I must say, Dr. Scappatura, I've annotated your book, and I thoroughly recommend people get yourself a copy. It's very detailed, very well researched, and really does raise some important questions, gets you thinking. He's currently researching the implications for Australia of the Pentagon's warfighting doctrine against China. Thank you, Dr. Scappatura. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Kellie. I promised I did not ask for that endorsement from Kellie at all. That was totally unsurprised, but I'm very grateful for it. Thank you. I'm glad you're enjoying it. Okay, so I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Macquarie University land on which I am present today, the Wadawurrung clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since the Dreamtime. I pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people present here today. Okay, I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Host disabled participant screen sharing. Are you able to give me that access so I can run a little slideshow?
It should be fixed.
Here we go. Yes, great. Okay. Fantastic. Okay, so I thought I'd begin just by giving a quick overview of some of the submissions that I've received so far to the inquiry. I've been astounded with the quality of the submissions submitted thus far. They've come from a variety of different people, you know, unaffiliated individuals, individual concerned citizens, peace activists, retired ADF personnel, academics, and a whole host of others. The concerns are kind of the ones that you would expect, you know, concerns about Australia being dragged into conflict again, concerns about the militarization of the region, dangers of a declining US empire and the rise of China. There's a big focus on China so far, in fact, in the submissions, which is quite understandable, and some very thoughtful submissions made about possible alternatives to Australia's defence policy as well. So I'm really pleased so far with the submissions, and I've been learning a lot by reading them. I encourage others out there who haven't made a submission yet to please do so. The submissions don't have to, you know, be large numbers of pages with detailed references. We've had submissions like that, but I've had submissions of just, you know, a paragraph long expressing certain individual concerns, and all of that is really valuable to the inquiry. So yes, I urge those who haven't submitted already to please submit your ideas. So in that light, I've thought in my presentation today that I might touch on a couple of issues that that might stimulate some kind of discussion or invoke some of you who haven't submitted already to perhaps submit to the inquiry. So the ideas I'm going to, there's lots to touch on in defence and military. I'm not going to be able to cover all of it. Lots of stuff that I've had to leave out, but just a couple of key things. The ANZUS Treaty, first and foremost, can't really discuss the alliance without discussing the ANZUS Treaty. I'm going to follow by talking a little bit about threats to the so-called rules-based order, which is kind of a new catchphrase amongst Australia's national security community, and you know what that means and what it doesn't mean. Can't really discuss the alliance in terms of its military and defence impacts without looking at Pine Gap, the heart of the alliance. So I'm going to kind of touch on that very briefly, and then I'll finish off by focusing on China. I think this has been a major concern amongst Australia's national security community and the public at large, and of course lots of media attention on this, and really can't discuss the importance, the costs and consequences of the alliance without thinking about the rise of China and what that means for Australia and the alliance. Okay, so if we're going to talk about the foundations of the alliance, of course we have to discuss the ANZUS Treaty. Oops, sorry, went forward one too many. So it's seen to be the cornerstone, widely promoted as the cornerstone or bedrock of Australia's alliance with the United States. It's depicted that way by Australia's national security community across the bipartisan political spectrum. The phrase cornerstone or keystone of Australia's defence foreign policy with respect to the ANZUS Treaty appears at least 300 times in Hansard from the 1950s to 2010s, according to one research paper. Scott Morrison recently called the ANZUS Treaty the single most important achievement of the Liberal Party ever while in government. So not only is it considered an important achievement in terms of Australia's defence policy, but in terms of Australia's political history. It's also considered a kind of symbolic representation of the so-called shared values that Australia and the United States share, values such as freedom and democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and so on. It's referred to as more than just an alliance, something that goes beyond interests and goes to values, a friendship and a commitment forged on the battlefield for over 100 years, and so on and so forth. And ANZUS kind of, you know, the idea is that ANZUS formalised this long-standing friendship. The idea of Australia and the US sharing mutual values was a much tougher sell during the Trump administration, but nonetheless, the attempt was made. So in reality, I think it's important to point out that the ANZUS Treaty provides only a very weak commitment to mutual defence. The ANZUS Treaty states that the parties will only consult together whenever there is a so-called threat to the peace. It's not a guarantee. Australia wanted a NATO-like guarantee during the negotiation of ANZUS, but only got a weak commitment to consult. Those limitations in the ANZUS Treaty reflect the specific interests of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the senior advisory body for military matters in the United States. Australia's diplomats pushed and wanted access to Pentagon's global strategic planning and how Australia might fit into that planning, where and under what conditions Australian forces would be deployed as part of America's kind of global war plans. But when the Joint Chiefs of Staff were told by Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State at the time, this is in the early 1950s, late 1940s, they had, quote, a sustained tantrum. The JCS wanted maximum Australian participation in any future war with minimal constraints and limiting US reciprocal obligations to defend Australia. So unlike other US alliances, the ANZUS text refers to attacks in the whole Pacific area, which would include attacks on US forces in South Korea and Japan or on Taiwan. It means that there is a far greater likelihood and a greater obligation on the smaller ally, Australia, to militarily aid the United States. And of course, the history of alliance warfighting has thus been Australia participating largely in US-led wars to defend against threats or challenges to American global hegemony, and not the other way around, whether that be socialism, communism, independent nationalism, terrorism, or whatever. So once again, in the present, ANZUS is being utilized by the US to bring Australia into its great power conflict with China, which it views as a threat to its military dominance of the region or its hegemony. We learned last year, as part of the annual AUSMIN consultations between Australia and the US, AUSMIN, the Australia-US ministerial consultations that happen every year as part of the kind of political infrastructure of ANZUS, that secret political military guidance or planning is being developed to coordinate Australia and US forces for conflict with China. Presumably, the planning would address things like the role of US forces based in Australia, including long-range American bombers, in any potential conflict with China, or the specific contingencies that might bring about their deployment and how Australian forces might also be expected to participate. Of course, the planning is secret, so we don't know what is contained in it. But the Australian and US militaries are already very highly integrated with one another in terms of interoperability, equipment, doctrine, strategy. And this is solidified by very large and extensive wargaming exercises, which unfortunately I don't have time to go into today. But this addition of kind of political military guidance to coordinate the deployment of troops between both countries adds kind of a further degree of what is already very significant momentum and pressure for any future Australian leader to join the US in a conflict with China should some crisis that emerge. That momentum, that pressure, that integration makes it very difficult for any future PM to say no should the US request Australian participation. Okay, so these days we don't hear as much about the alliance as the cornerstone of Australia's security. We hear it every now and then, but we hear more about how indispensable the alliance is for securing a rules-based regional and global order. I'm sure you've heard of this phrase if you've been paying attention at all to foreign affairs and foreign relations, particularly with respect to the US and China. This rules-based regional or global order is fairly poorly defined and debated. Supposedly it's based on liberal values of freedom and openness and the rule of law, and participation and adherence to international institutions like the UN and WTO and so on, but it's never really clearly defined. In actual fact, support for the so-called rules-based order is often used as a kind of more palatable way for describing support for US strategic economic interests, given that it is the US that has largely crafted the rules of the international system for its benefit, and whose frequent and flagrant violations, quite frankly, of the rules are never portrayed as a threat to those rules or the foundations of those rules. Anyway, China, on the other hand, which I should say has been explicitly labeled by the Trump administration and even the Biden administration as a kind of revisionist state, is considered a major threat to the current rules-based international order. And Australia has more subtly expressed the same viewpoint. I want to address this because it's kind of an important element of Australia's defense of its kind of antagonism towards China and its further integration with the United States. The characterization of China as a threat to the global rules-based order, I believe, is highly misleading. even if one equates the rules-based order as defined by the United States, and as shown in the table on the slide there, China accepts many of the core rules and institutions of the international system. Yes, it rejects some too, but where it does reject elements of the current order, the departure is not unlike any other great power, especially the United States and even Australia on occasion, who rejects the international rules like UN arbitration over disputes with Timor-Leste or the invasion of Iraq or many others. So yes, China is building military features on disputed islands in the South China Sea, and that is a rejection of current norms. But then the US violates similar norms, actually more frequently, more expansively, and more egregiously throughout the entire world. And yet apparently it does so without demolishing or even posing a threat to the so-called free and open rules-based order. The point that I'm trying to make here is not that China doesn't pose challenges to some widely accepted international norms that Australians should and do value, or that even we should respond in some way, but that these challenges shouldn't be exaggerated to depict China as some kind of hyper-revisionist power intent on replacing US hegemony, upending the current international order, and opposing its authoritarian values around the world, which is certainly how the Trump administration depicted China and how the incoming now Biden administration has indicated it shares more than less of those same views. China is most concerned in its foreign policy with protecting its highly oppressive rule at home from external criticism. It's concerned about forging foreign relationships conducive to economic growth. It's not so concerned about exporting its model of authoritarianism abroad or reshaping the global order in its domestic authoritarian vision. China today is not like revolutionary China of the 1950s and 60s. China has, very real and important stake in the current kind of global capitalist system, of which it has derived many benefits and into which it is actually quite highly integrated. A point that I'll discuss in a little more detail later on. But yes, depicting China as this kind of revisionist power or a unique threat to the rules-based order is really a way for the US and Australia to kind of rationalize this desire to see Washington cling on to its position of hegemony. Okay, so I mentioned that we can't really discuss the costs and consequences of the alliance in the realm of military and defense without mentioning Pine Gap. So Pine Gap is really the heart or strategic essence of the alliance. It would be hard to imagine the alliance surviving without the existence of Pine Gap. It's much more important in a practical sense than the ANZUS Treaty. Pine Gap is probably the most significant intelligence gathering facility outside of the United States. Many of you are probably already familiar with Pine Gap and what it does. I'm not going to spend too much time describing its functions, but basically it serves to intercept foreign military and civilian communications, provide intel on the nature and location of foreign defense systems, track conventional nuclear missile launches, all of that which is fed back into the US coordinated globe-spanning Five Eyes intelligence network, as well as the US military for direct application on the battlefield, including controversially drone assassinations. The argument by Australia's national security establishment is that Australia couldn't hope to independently defend ourselves without the intelligence provided by Pine Gap. In fact, the late Professor Desmond Ball, the very influential and authoritative expert on Pine Gap, argued in the years before his death in the mid-2000s, that Pine Gap gives Australia everything and nothing. That is, it provides incredible amounts of intelligence that are useful mainly for US global military operations or Australian participation in coalition wars, but not particularly useful for our own defense needs and our own interests. The pivotal role that Pine Gap plays in providing actionable battlefield military intelligence for US forces means that there is no war the US can be involved in the Indo-Pacific or the Middle East without Australia's automatic participation through Pine Gap. And that makes, additionally, Australia a target of US adversaries, and particularly a target for a nuclear, ICBM. Look, there's lots more about Pine Gap that we could say, but there's no time to go into the details. I've put a link there to the Nautilus Institute's Pine Gap project, which is a fantastic resource in case you're interested to learn more about the importance of that facility. The only additional point I want to raise this evening about Pine Gap is kind of to bring your attention to its kind of changing purpose once again. As during the War on Terror, when Pine Gap was used to prioritize US military action in the Middle East, such as drone assassinations, today the Five Eyes intelligence network of of which Pine Gap is a key node, is being repurposed to fulfill America's great power competition with China. So according to a recent investigation by Bloomberg, with a dozen former and current Five Eyes intelligence officials, this new role of the Five Eyes intelligence network means that intelligence collected around the world will always have a Chinese angle, will always look for Chinese threats, just as we once saw events in Angola through the prism of the Soviet Union. In that respect, it is a kind of return to the Cold War. And so as with ANZUS, as with the new focus on the rules-based order, as with increasing defense integration between Australia and the US, Pine Gap and the Five Eyes Alliance is being kind of repurposed to suit primarily American great power interests. Okay, so the last, actually I'm just keeping an eye on the time. How much time do I have left, Kellie?
We have some flexibility, Vince, so keep going.
I've got a few minutes. Okay. All right, good. It's just the last couple of slides. Okay, great. Just a few points about the supposed China threat before wrapping up, because as I mentioned before, if we're going to understand the contemporary costs and consequences of the alliance, we really need to understand the primary role of China in American strategic thinking. So the new Biden administration has made it clear that it intends to largely continue Trump's more assertive posture towards China, both militarily and economically, although with less crude rhetoric and a greater effort and finesse in mobilizing US allies. So militarily, the Biden administration is effectively resurrecting the pivot to Asia that was initiated by Obama, but incorporating kind of new Pentagon warfighting strategies developed during the Trump administration. So in particular, the Pentagon plans to distribute US forces more widely, more heavily across the Indo-Pacific, with a new role for the Army and for the Marines operating within and around what's referred to as the first island chain surrounding China, armed with kind of more mobile, long-range precision fires. Precision fires that had been prohibited by treaty until the Trump administration withdrew from that particular arms control agreement. Ostensibly, this new or increasing military encirclement of China is required to neutralize, China's short and medium-range missile advantages in China's near seas, and thereby prevent what's referred to as a fait accompli, which basically means the concern is that China may initiate a kind of rapid military attack on Taiwan and then dig in before the US can move in sufficient forces to repel the attack. That's the kind of justification. When the head of Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Phil Davidson, presented his $27 billion Pacific Deterrence Initiative earlier this month to Congress as a budget request to beef up America's military presence around China in the form that I just described, he raised the alarm that China may attempt to invade Taiwan in the next 6 years. This kind of statement is pure threat inflation to justify further militarization of the Indo-Pacific in order to maintain US primacy or military dominance. China is not on the verge of invading Taiwan. China's preference is to deter independence rather than compel unification by force. That is not to say that there are not legitimate concerns about China's use of coercion and political warfare to try and pressure Taiwan, probably to negotiate a reunification deal on Beijing's terms sometime in the future. But that's fundamentally different from concerns about an all-out invasion, which remain an incredibly costly proposition for China and would perhaps do irreversible damage to the CCP's, China's Communist Party's, reputation and legitimacy, especially if it were to fail. Xi Jinping is perhaps less risk-averse than other recent Chinese leaders, but he's not about to embark on an irrational, military invasion of Taiwan. And similarly with China's kind of regional military strategy more broadly, it's not about kicking the US out of the Indo-Pacific. It's about responding to decades of weakness when the US could project force right up to China's shores militarily and dominate in China's near seas. China's military strategy is about responding to US intervention, not denying the US military access to the entire region, which it doesn't have the capacity to in any case. Washington's kind of choosing to depict China's attempt to balance against the US and its near shores as a threat to the entire regional balance in US national security interests in order to rationalize its own kind of desire to maintain primacy. Okay, so last slide, I just want to finish up on the other so-called threat from China, which is the economic threat. once again here, the idea that China is posing a threat to Australia, to the region, and to the US global economic supremacy is vastly exaggerated. We're experiencing at the moment current trade restrictions over the past year, but those trade restrictions in fact demonstrate the limitations of China's economic coercion. Despite restrictions on barley and beef and wine and timber and coal, imposed by China, and we can talk about the reasons why that is, perhaps if you're interested in the Q&A. Australia's overall dollar value exports to China are actually booming, and this is largely a result of increases in the value of iron ore exports to China, which have been conspicuously left off the trade restriction list. Australia recorded actually its second highest ever level of goods exported to China in 2020, 148 billion, which is a few billion less than 2019, but 10% more than 2018, which was the third biggest year. The reality of what's happening here is that China has no realistic alternative when it comes to iron ore, which is by far the largest share of value in Australia's exports in China. And so while it's not negligible, China's economic power, there's a lot of exaggeration about China's capacity to engage in kind of economic coercion of Australia, particularly in order to extract political gains. In fact, it's had the opposite effect, as we've seen. Business has largely fallen into line with the government, and kind of nationalist anti-China rhetoric, continues to dominate the public discourse. Australia is not changing tack at all. Okay, so that picture that I've got up on the slide there, just to demonstrate a kind of comparison with the United States. I mean, no one talks about the economic leverage held by the United States over Australia. China's economic leverage pales in comparison to the United States. America's cumulative investment stake in Australia is 10 times as large as China's. And in fact, the majority of Australia's biggest companies are owned by US investors and shareholders. That graph on there is taken from some research done by Professor Clinton Fernandez. China's capacity, to use its economic coercion to extend its political and strategic influence in the region is also frequently exaggerated. It's claimed, for example, that China poses a threat to the sovereignty of nations by engaging in what's called debt trap diplomacy, ensnaring countries with loans they can't repay, and then when they default, China goes in and seizes certain strategic assets like ports for use by the Chinese Navy. This is just pure fabrication. Several studies have demonstrated that this whole debt trap diplomacy concept doesn't exist. There's one most recently published by Chatham House, which I'll provide a link to on the slide there. There is no grand geostrategic objective driving China's Belt and Road Initiative. It's significantly economic drivers that underpin China's initiative, created by China's kind of serious overcapacity problems at home. The anticipated decision by the Morrison government to ban Victoria's BRI agreement or memorandum of understanding with China outright because of security or geostrategic concerns really makes no sense, except in the context of fear-mongering on domestic political purposes. If you're interested more in reading about this myth about BRI and debt trap diplomacy and China's kind of geostrategic ambitions through economic coercion, you can follow that link on the slide. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit more about the supposed myth of just to wrap up in a minute or so, because I know I'm over time here. Just quickly, the biggest myth of all, which is that China is on the verge of replacing the US as the world's largest and most powerful economy. This, of course, fuels fears about concerns, of China translating its economic power into strategic power and political influence. But the truth is that while China is certainly a powerful global economic player, it just doesn't have the same structural economic power at present necessary to challenge US primacy, and it faces significant obstacles ahead in the future. Over the past 30 years or so of neoliberal globalization, particularly since China's accession to the World Trade Organization, Chinese impressive economic growth through foreign direct investment has had stunning impacts, positive impacts, but it's come at the expense of an incredible level of ownership by US and other Western corporations. Something like 80% of the most dynamic and technologically advanced sectors of China's exports are dominated by joint ventures and, in fact, mostly wholly owned foreign subsidiaries. So even in the domestic market, there are several key sectors dominated by foreign corporations. And I've got a couple of graphs here on the next slide, which you can have a look at in more detail if you like, describing that process or that fact. But yes, China's integration into global financial markets has actually increased over the past year, even despite the trade restrictions imposed by the Trump administration. Companies like PayPal, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, American Express, BlackRock, and other big financial companies have all increased their access over the past year in China's stock and bonds. Foreign ownership currently sits at 837 billion, which is an 8-fold increase since 2014. The point that I'm trying to make here is that this kind of level of penetration and dependence on a foreign, especially US capital, is not indicative of a rising, economic hegemon. While China is, and the Trump administration's attempts to cripple China's high-tech sector with bans on semiconductors and the like demonstrate, how the US still maintains structural economic power and the vulnerabilities inherent in China's attempt to, develop under a kind of US-led neoliberal globalization. So China is relatively geopolitically independent. That's from the US, that's certainly the case, but it's still very highly economically dependent and highly integrated into kind of US global capitalism. That doesn't mean it won't be able to break free of that dependence, perhaps, and become kind of self-reliant in key technologies in the future. It's clearly trying to do this, as well as, overcome serious domestic economic problems like a shrinking workforce and aging population. But whether it can do so or not, remains to be seen. We're certainly not there yet, and the indicators aren't particularly positive. Okay, so I might leave it there. Apologies, Alison, for going over time.
Dr. Scappatura, that was outstanding. And I ask people to place any questions they may have for our speakers in the chat box, and we'll visit that after Dr. Broinowski's presentation. But thank you, Vince. Leading the inquiry's foreign policy panel is the formidable Dr. Alison Broinowski, whom I have long admired for her extensive work in this area. She is a former Australian diplomat who is also an author. I have one of her books here, Alison Broinowski's Howard's War, which I will devour over the coming days. She's an author and academic. She's Vice President of Australians for War Powers Reform, which has been collaborating with IPAN for several years. Thank you, Dr. Broinowski. You have the floor.
Thank you, Kelly. And thank you, Vince, for covering most of the ground and saving me having to do it. What I'll try to do is maybe give, without disagreeing with you on anything, give a few slightly different slants from the foreign policy perspective, if I may. And thank you to IPAN and to all the contributors who have put their thoughts into sending us their contributions to this panel. I really appreciate them. The ones that I have are less numerous, I think, than Vince has. And that's interesting to me because foreign policy, what is it that scares people off foreign policy? Are they scared? Or is it that they just feel, and this is what I'm guessing, is it that they just feel there's nothing we can do? It's all been taken out of our hands. There's no opposition to it's all bipartisan. Everything is decided in Canberra without consulting us. And what is the point of us developing complex opinions and arguments about Australia's foreign policy? Very reasonable questions. And I wouldn't blame people for being deterred from taking the trouble to contribute to this panel because of those thoughts. I actually have 4 very good contributions, 3 of them quite short, from Denise Morrow, Kerry James, and Dennis Murphy, and a long one from Nick Dean. You can always expect something great from Nick Dean. But all of them are very much without expressing things differently. They're very much on the same page as I am and as I think most members of IPAN are, and probably many of you in the Zoom audience. That is to say, you all understand the importance of a popular input to our foreign policy and the way it is shaped and determined. And I think, if I may speak for those contributors and perhaps for many of you, you feel that it's not in our hands enough. It's not controlled enough by us. Our democratic system isn't responding sufficiently to what we would like to see as our foreign policy. And of course, that's exactly what IPAN is all about. One of my contributors is a Quaker, and she says the answer to achieving peace is peace, and takes a Quaker to have a really simple, straightforward answer. But how in Australia's foreign policy do we achieve peace when, for all of our history, for all of Australia's settler history, our foreign policy has been about war? It started even before we went to war. Australia was settled by British armed forces, let's remember, the Navy and the Army. Australia achieved settlement by going to war with the Indigenous people. And the wars against the Indigenous people went on and on for years. And a country that is brought up in that culture imbibes it and doesn't lose it readily. And so in the first part of our history as a so-called independent country from 1901, we did exactly what British colonies did. Every time the mother country was at war, we sent troops, not only to World War I and World War II, but to many colonial wars as well, including, would you believe, against the Maoris in New Zealand, something many people have forgotten. So war was part of our DNA, and I don't think we've got rid of it. I think it's still there. Yesterday, I was talking on a different Zoom meeting with a young woman, very intelligent, very well informed, who actually said, but when the United States goes to war, so does Australia, it's automatic. Whew. I began to think that all of our efforts for years in Australians for War Powers Reform have been for nothing. Because if we haven't made an impression on a well-informed person like that, to make her say, why is it automatic? Does it have to be automatic? Then we're not getting anywhere. We're not getting anywhere with less well-informed, less intelligent people either. And yet, that's not to suggest that people out there don't know what we're talking about. Australians for War Powers Reform recently forked out some hard won money given to us by a generous donor to do another in our series of opinion polls about how Australia goes to war. And then we ran a full-page advertisement in several newspapers giving the results, which show that over 80% of Australians do understand, contrary to what I just said, do understand what it's about, and do understand, once the question is put to them, that the way Australia goes to war needs to change. Now, that is a fundamental part of Australia's foreign policy. Just as war is part of our DNA, the way we go to war is a very formative element in the way we do foreign policy. And it's a shame, in my view, because there are many other middle powers who don't spend all their time thinking about going to war, who don't spend all their time thinking about what they should do to oblige their allies, but think about other ways of doing useful things. The ASEAN countries, for instance, in Southeast Asia, have a treaty of amity and cooperation, which Australia has signed, in which they say, echoing the UN Charter, that we will not, that the nations parties to the treaty will not acquire or employ or threaten their neighbors, their other part, all their neighbors with use of force. Now, we have actually signed up for that. And Vince was talking about our failure to apply our own international rules-based order to ourselves. We talk all the time about going to war. We talk about it as this, my interlocutor yesterday said, it's automatic. Now, what Australia does, instead of prosecuting foreign policy in the way many of our neighbors skillfully do, countries smaller than ours, smaller in terms of power than ours, find ways of doing diplomacy properly, find ways of living with, cohabiting with our regional neighbors in ways that don't mean when we have a problem with them that we have to go to war to resolve it. Now, this is where Australia has been not only lacking in recent years, but increasing that lack. Most of you, as old as me, will remember the years of Asian engagement and how enthusiastic we were about everything to do with Asia and how grateful we were to China, in fact, for the trade relationship that saved us from the global financial crisis. How we cooperated with the ASEANs on that treaty, but also in forming the East Asia Summit, something in which Australia enthusiastically took part. Everything changed for the worse when we went to war in 2001. It wasn't that it hadn't been happening drip by drip before that, with Australian governments saying we didn't need to change anything in order to get on with our Asian neighbors, unquote. But everything changed in 2001 because we swallowed the red pill of the war on terror. And that whoever invented that expression was a genius, because if what you want is endless war that never finishes, is never won or lost, but generates enormous amounts of government expenditure, that is how to do it. And they did it, and we swallowed it. And Australians were told by the Prime Minister, because the United States is fighting a war on terror, Australia is automatically fighting it too. Now, we were not, because the ANZUS Treaty, as Vince explained, didn't commit us to any such thing. And we could and should have said, no, we're not. But a lot of other countries did. They swallowed it too. So we went to Afghanistan, then we went to Iraq, then we went to Syria, and in two cases, we're still there, still fighting the war on terror. And may I say, as a sort of a interjection to myself here, there is no wonder that we have bad behavior and bad morale among our troops in Afghanistan. If you send well-trained SAS people, highly motivated, to a country to do things that they were not trained to do, without explaining to them why they're there or why they're doing it, then you can expect bad morale. If you send them there on 4 or 5 rotations, they just keep going for nothing but the money. And sooner or later, they're going to behave badly. And they did. And it's our fault that they did, because we didn't have any rationale for those wars apart from the US alliance. That's all. And why do we constantly go to war? Because the US says so, because we fantasize that that guarantees that the United States will defend us. As Vince said, it's an empty treaty. It is not obligatory on either side to do that. Now, what I disagree with, because Kim Beazley, in his wisdom as ambassador in the United States, decided that he could see through this too. And he realized that the only way we would get the United States to actually defend Australia in a crisis was if they had bases on our territory. They would defend a base. They wouldn't defend Australian capital cities. There'd be the equivalent of the Brisbane line, right? They'd defend everything north of the Brisbane line. In this case, they would defend Pine Gap and Darwin if we gave them bases in Darwin. And that's why the Asian pivot came about. And that's why we got US troops on the ground in Darwin, which, as I've argued in the paper that I wrote for IPAN, is the quintessential example of lack of sovereignty and independence. Now, IPAN is about peace and independence, and we have surrendered both because we allow US troops on our sovereign territory. And once they're there, as I know from working in the Philippines years ago, they're very hard to get out. They come and they stay and they don't go away. And again, as Vince said, they make us a target. We are the target. If, for instance, China wanted to send the United States a message to say, be careful, we can do things, we'll show you, where would be the most convenient, painless, cost-free way of doing it? By attacking Pine Gap or attacking Darwin? Think about it. Is it worth it for us? Is this what our foreign policy should be about? I would argue not. And I'll make one further point, if I may, Kellie, just quickly. We have also allowed, because of bipartisanship in foreign policy for years and years and years, we have allowed our Foreign Service and our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to go down the drain, to be degraded from a policy department to a process operation, as one of our most distinguished diplomats says. And this means that we don't even have the skills and capacity that we need to do the sort of negotiations that I'm talking about and adjustments that I think are necessary with our neighbors, including China. We don't have the clout anymore that we used to have, the skills, the finesse. The Chinese are walking all over us in English and with their public diplomacy presentations as well. Australia looks like it doesn't care, it doesn't know, and it goes to meetings and says what the United States says, and nobody listens because they already know what the United States thinks. Now, this is what we have to change. And how can we change it? People like you. The only way we can change it is by telling our government it is dangerous, it is misguided, and Australia, if it's going to survive in this century, and I'm not only talking about climate change, where we're behind the world ball game as well, not only that, but about the actual sovereign risk to our country. And the only way we can ensure that is by independence, and the only way we can get that is out of our government. And if our governments won't give it to us, then we just have to do what we do as a democratic country and change the government. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alison. Always a voice of reason, a sublime voice of reason, I must say. We have quite a few questions that have come through, bearing in mind the time. So that permits us 10 minutes. I will try and get through as many of those questions as possible for our speakers. And I ask you to remain on mute, and I'll sort of give a little signal when we get to, as we approach 7 p.m. So the first question is for you, Vince. The question is, hasn't Xi Jinping staked his reputation at home on achieving reunification with Taiwan? And doesn't this raise the possibility of China using military force against Taiwan?
Thanks, Kelly. I've been trying to write back to some of the questions in the chat in order to save a bit of time, but yeah, I'll just repeat what I said very talking tough on Taiwan, right? All Chinese leaders need to talk tough on Taiwan. But as far as I'm aware, he hasn't set any clear deadlines for unification with Taiwan. And in fact, has even kind of backtracked a little bit recently. The reality is that Xi Jinping knows very well that there are incredible risks, as I mentioned, in a full-scale invasion in Taiwan. It's not clear that China would be successful, not clear at all. And even if it were successful initially, occupying Taiwan and incorporating into China could do all sorts of untold damage to China's domestic economic program as well. If it should fail, it would ruin Xi Jinping's, reputation and possibly develop enough political instability at home that it would threaten the whole CCP. China's been waiting a long time for reunification of Taiwan. It's fundamentally a political problem, not a military problem. It can play the long game. As I mentioned, its preference is to kind of engage in political coercion or political influence to try and convince Taiwan that, look, you've got no option except to reunify with us. And presumably Beijing wants to pressure in a way so that they will reunify on terms that is beneficial to China. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be, concerned about that. Protecting the independence of a flourishing democratic nation like Taiwan is certainly something that Australia, has interest in. But once again, this is a political, diplomatic issue. It's not about China on the verge of launching a military invasion of Taiwan in the next several years, which is the justification for the militarization which is occurring around Taiwan and the South China Sea, which is then fueling China's response of increasing militarization and the whole fulfilling cycle of violence.
Thank you, Vince. The next question is for you, Alison. Do you think the lack of citizen interest and engagement in our foreign policies relates to a weak national identity, and how do you think this can be turned around? And I would also add another question to that about encouraging you to provide your insights into the shift within DFAT in terms of their attitude towards China.
Yeah. Just dealing with the last part first, Kelly, there has been that shift quite palpably in not only in DFAT, but in the whole of government. Just watching it from my distance in Sydney, I probably miss a few things that I miss a lot that goes on the ground in Canberra, I must say. But there has been a sea change in Canberra in the attitude of people with influential opinions towards, let's call it Sinophobia. China is public enemy number one for these people. And their language is about, if we don't push back, they'll take advantage of us. They only understand one language, and we have to tell it to them. And this is very much encouraged, I have to say, by ASPI, which is paid in part, financed in part by the US State Department and also by the weapons industry. So they have a vested interest in this sort of stuff, in cranking up war without asking what the consequences of such a war might be. I mean, I described them in my talk. If China wanted to make a target out of Australia, we would be toast. And this is quite different from the United States. We live here. We've got to get on with our neighbors. And there's no problem. There should be no problem for us in getting on with our neighbors, who are, after all, our largest trading partner. It's to our advantage to do so. not the other way around. But there is a real surge of xenophobia in China like I have not seen since the days of the Cold War. And one of my oldest mates, Greg Clark, wrote a book called In Fear of China in 1967. Get it? It describes today. And it was phony then, and it's phony now. We don't need it. And it's hyped up by the weapons industry and the people who want another war. And may I include in that, to quite a large extent, the News Corp media, who love nothing better than a war and whose columnists keep banging the China drum, which unfortunately some of the Fairfax people have lately picked up as well. And to write something sensible about China, as some brave souls still try to do, is to court all kinds of insults about how soft-headed you are, etc., etc. Now, if only people would realize that for a middle power like what the United States does is its own business, but for a middle power like Australia to do what the United States wants, like, for instance, attacking Taiwan, that's absolute suicide for us. And there's absolutely no need for us to do it. Even Menzies, in the 60s, told the United States that we would not go to war over Quemoy and Matsu because these islands were not of interest to us, and we're not going to fight the Chinese over them. And he was absolutely right. And that is the kind of courage which we don't see in any of our politicians, government or opposition today. And I have to add that bipartisanship in foreign policy is another cause of the decline that you describe. As well as that, the only other point to add to that is, from my observation, although there are still some very good people in DFAT and they do good work, the people who are ambitious and want to wield power go elsewhere. If they were in DFAT at the beginning, they then move on to somewhere else because there is no power in DFAT, there is no influence, and the ministers' offices, particularly the Prime Minister's department, are where it happens. And that's where the decisions get made. And that, unfortunately, is where the US influence is most powerfully felt.
Thank you, Alison. It's now 2 minutes to 7. We might just take one more question, and then I will do a wrap up to let our speakers go and attend to their other activities this evening. Vince, how do you think we can counter the xenophobia that has taken hold without being named as agents of China?
Yes, that's a difficult one, of course, because that's the way that the discourse is presented to marginalize and delegitimize the very real and legitimate concerns about Australia's integration with the United States and exposing some of the myths about exactly what kind of threat and how large the threat that China poses. So you can't neutralize that entirely. That's just always going to be there because that's the strategy. I certainly think that we should not refrain from criticizing the very real and oppressive human rights abuses that occur within China. I mean, this is China's biggest concern and gripe, as I mentioned before, wanting to protect itself from criticism of abuses at home. Well, we should not accept that. We should definitely make sure that as part of our response to the exaggeration of the China threat and calling for more independent foreign policy, that we don't, that we're not afraid to criticize China where it deserves to be criticized. And there are many areas, particularly in domestic policy, where it deserves to be criticized. And I think that will go some way towards deflecting the mislabel that Australia is, you know, a puppet of China. I also think we need to reclaim the idea of being supporters of the United States and friends of the United States. Anytime, you know, those of us criticize kind of US militarism or criticize, you know, US belligerence on the international stage, we're kind of labeled as anti-American. In fact, I think it's the other way around. You know, the military, given the huge domestic problems that the United States has, you know, undermines US interest, the US public interest as well. And there are plenty of progressives in the United States who are kind of fighting for a similar kind of cause that we're fighting for here in terms of pushing for a peaceful diplomatic resolution to relations between the United States and China. And one last point too, which I think Shirley raised in the chat, which is that if we're talking about independence, we're talking about independence from all powers, not just, you know, the United States.
Thank you, Vince. Look, it is 7 p.m. I know that there are many questions that you have put to the speakers this evening. Perhaps the speakers, if they have time after we conclude, may be able to provide responses in the chat box briefly. But I would like to take the opportunity of noting the fine minds of Dr. Vince Scappatura and Dr. Alison Broinowski in that foreign policy defence space. And really, it is such a privilege to have them speaking to us this evening. I would just like to give a final reminder to people to take the opportunity to make a submission to this important inquiry. So many people are working hard behind the scenes to give your voice legs and as I said, elevate it above the current toxic discourse. You can follow developments on social media. Please don't forget about the questionnaire. The details I can see are in the chat box if you would like to complete that questionnaire. I'd like to thank Sam Brennan, Annette Brownlee again, and others within IPAN for producing this event this evening. The next webinar will be held on 22 April at 6 p.m. The topic is economics and workers' rights, and Professor Jeannie Ray and Dr. Chad Satterley will be providing their expertise on this subject area. That concludes the webinar for this evening. I sincerely thank our speakers and IPAN for their important and ongoing work, and I thank you for your time. We can't do what we do without your input and your contributions. So please jump on the website, People's Inquiry. I'll just say that again, People's Inquiry. It's independentpeacefulaustralia.com.au. You'll find all the links on that website. Thanks again and good night to you all.